Hello, my name is Philippine, and you are watching Rappler. President Ferdinand Marcos Jr. is back from Washington, D.C., although he also just left for Indonesia, this time for the ASEAN Summit. But for this Rappler Talk interview, we will be focusing on Philippine-US ties and where it's heading under President Marcos. More importantly, what it means for the average Filipino, the Philippines, policy-wise, and also the rest of the region. Because, like, we'll find out later, we'll talk about this later, we are a key mover or key point of interest in the Southeast Asia, but also the rest of the Asia Pacific. Joining me today is Dr. Alma Salvador. She's a political scientist and international relations expert. She's also a associate professor of the Ateneo de Manila Political Science Department. Thank you for joining me today, Alma.
Hi, Bea. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So let's cut right through it. No, see, President Marcos visited Washington, D.C. He met with President Biden. He had breakfast with Vice President Kamala Harris. Nagkaroon ng event sa Pentagon with the Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. He also met with his counterpart in agriculture. May dinner pa with State Secretary Anthony Blinken. Kumbaga, this is only the third highest sort of visit, official working visit lang siya in the context of U.S. diplomatic relations, no? But it was quite an itinerary for his first visit, well, second visit to the U.S., first to Washington. What does this tell you about how Washington, the U.S., perhaps to be more specific, the Biden administration, sees its relationship with the Philippines?
Yeah, okay. So I think we need to look at the context first, the present context of the U.S.-China hegemonic rivalry. It's a fast evolving context in which the competition is already extending at different fronts. Competition extends at the level of economics, at the level of defense and security, and we are being confronted by a traditional hegemonic power such as the United States, who is, on the other hand, also not comfortable with an emerging bipolarity. So, the United States since 1989 has enjoyed long years of unilateral
Yeah.
hegemonic rule. So, given what's going on at the moment, there is a power contest coming from China, and it's very obvious that the United States is not comfortable with an emerging
Yeah.
bipolar kind of transfer of power or hegemonic power circulations. Not comfortable about that, because if she were, then the question of having trade wars should not figure in the U.S. China power dynamic, but she's not comfortable. So, and interestingly, the historical experience naman of China is such that ayaw naman niya ng tinatrato lamang siyang second class. So, the plan of China is to sort of rectify itself from its own previous historical context and rectify itself. So that context is significant, and because of that context, the whole Indo-Pacific strategy of the United States has to be sort of activated. It has
Yeah.
to be activated along the lines of their decision to maintain a unilateral position because of the assertion and the argument that there has to be a rule-based order. So we are saying that if perhaps the rival of the United States is uh, an actor that plays by the rules, then maybe it would be different, but we're not really so sure about that, because earlier on the rivalry also involved Japan,
Yeah.
and there were, of course, some trade wars and between United States and Japan much earlier. So the whole idea of transferring power is really problematic in the context of international relations. So yun ang konteksto na ayaw ng Amerika ng ganong klaseng power transfer, especially from an actor, which happens to be China, who doesn't want to play by the rules and very revisionist ang tendency. So second element, in order to answer your question, is the fact that the Philippines has a different role now. It's a different positioning. First and foremost, the Philippines is already a middle power. She's enjoyed that position perhaps sometime in 2019 or so, according to the Lowy Asia Power Index. So mahalaga yun. Well, the fact of the matter is, meron na siyang konting leverage. Interestingly, the leverage of the Philippines, it's still anchored very much on the alliance that it has with the United States and its defense relationships with other middle powers such as Japan, Korea, and Australia. Pero ang part of the reason why there's a revitalization of the interests of of the US to the Philippines is because Marcos has decided to pivot back to the
Mm.
Philippines. Remember, all the way 6 years, 6 full years
Yeah.
under the Duterte administration, it was the relationship,
Sorry.
the U.S.-Philippine alliance was dormant, was downgraded at the level of speech, at the level of practice, at the level of defense, etc. So uh, the pivoting back to the United States, a very cordial relationship on the part of Marcos towards the United States is an advantage. It's an advantage because that means strategically the United States can also maneuver and execute the Indo-Pacific strategy within the context that there are perhaps rotational American forces from the northern part of the Philippines, Japan, etc. So there is this trilateral area from which the
Yeah.
United States can very much execute its Indo-Pacific strategy. So for that reason alone, the agency on the part of President Marcos to go back to the United States as a foreign policy partner is significant for the U.S. to be able to execute the Asian side of the Indo-Pacific
Right.
strategy.
Right, and it was quite a dramatic return, kumbaga, to actively wanting good ties with the U.S. Because if you recall, right, yung first visit ni President Marcos to New York, he spoke of not being able to imagine a future without America, without the U.S., a future for the Philippines. And then, sabi nga niya, it's an upside. Our relationship is cyclical, and we're on an upside currently. And siguro to emphasize also, right, before the trip to Washington, Marcos himself attended Balikatan, the biggest to date. And I just
Yeah.
remember that in 2017, the first Balikatan under Duterte, it was a sad Balikatan, like not even 3,000 troops from the US. Now you have close to 17,000 American boots for this war exercise. Which leads me to my next question, but I also want to talk about the Indo-Pacific strategy perhaps in a bit.
Mm.
The term catch up has been used in terms of speaking about the situation in the South China Sea. And I'm not sure if it's the growing aggressions or because we're more forthright about reporting on these aggressions via the Philippine Coast Guard. No? So it might be na these things have always been happening, but now we're just more conscientious about reporting them to the public.
So your question is about, are we truly catching up in
No,
terms
yeah,
of
yeah,
foreign
yeah. I
policy?
mean, do you agree with that term that Marcos is playing catch up in terms of positioning or establishing the Philippines' position
Mm.
in the South China Sea conflict?
Um, yes, sort of
Mm,
catching up. Yes, because as I've said, from 2016 all the way to
mm,
2022, or in the middle part of 2022, the it was only in 2021 when Duterte decided to go back and put an end
mm,
to the appeasement policy with China. So imagine that. And in terms of joint exercises, it was very much downgraded. So in terms of
yeah.
number, in terms of the quality, in terms of the focus, HIDR, of course, is good. It's something that we need. It's something that our armed forces needs. However, um, it was really restrained both by the rhetoric, mainly by the rhetoric of Duterte. When I say rhetoric, because on the ground, practice wise, the key
Yeah.
major treaties of the United States and the Philippines continue to remain in place. These are the MDT, the FVA, and the EDCA. So Mutual Defense Treaty, the Visiting Forces Agreement, and the EDCA Defense Cooperation Agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement. They were not naman dismantled,
Yeah.
although of course sometime in
Threatened to.
2020, Yeah, may threat. So,
Yeah.
malakas talaga yung rhetoric against a very confrontational rhetoric. So, speech in IR kasi naman, in our relations with states, mahalaga ang speech. Hindi
Yeah.
naman natin isinasantabi ang speech. It's an element of diplomatic practice, speech. But at the same time, titingnan mo din yung convergence of speech and practice on the ground. So, on the ground, these agreements remain to be in place, which is why it's also hard to say totally that Duterte dismantled the entire U.S.-Philippine alliance because the key elements of the alliance were there. The core elements have been maintained. The thing is, the EDCA didn't progress at all.
Yeah.
So there were no additional sites. There were no enhanced forms of cooperation, such as because of downgraded balikatan exercises. The impact of that, of course, would be reduced exercises to improve our maritime security, to improve maritime domain awareness, interoperability, intelligence sharing. By the way, so the,
Yeah.
the, the more restricted in terms of scope and number of engagements that you have in terms of this joint or combined military exercises, then of course the ripple effect of which would be a clear reduction on those benefits. Now, is it really catching up in that sense? Well, in that sense, because no progress was made in EDCA, then I would say yes. But what Marcos is doing now, because what is to build on the existing, I would say, uh, security and strategic security partnerships that were earlier constructed under the Aquino administration. So it's the Aquino administration, because of its hard balancing foreign policy approach to vis-a-vis China. Hard balancing meaning talagang very specific anti-China and pro-United States. It's
Yeah.
completely a bandwagoning type of approach, pro-US, anti-China. But then the next layer of this relationship is ito yung tinatawag na multi-layer diplomatic strategy ng Aquino administration na sinusunod na ngayon ay sinusunod na ni Marcos. Yun yung so at the first level, it is how you're going to deal with the hegemonic powers, and that is to maintain and to bandwagon with the United States and to activate and cultivate the alliance, and eventually during the time of Aquino is to make sure that the Senate ratifies the EDCA, okay, for a prepositioning of American troops in the Philippines. Pero yung second layer nun, ito yung forging strategic partnerships, yung mga tinatawag na middle powers. So, nung panahon ni Aquino, nag-build tayo dyan. Japan, South Korea, Australia. Na ngayon, ay na pinagpatuloy yun ni Duterte,
Yeah.
incidentally. Kasi
Yeah.
si Duterte,
Yeah.
anti-US ako, pero pwede kong kaibiganin ang
Japan.
Japan,
Yeah.
pwede kong kaibiganin ng Australia, pwede kong pansinin ang South Korea. Okay, sa kay Duterte yon. Pero pagdating kay Marcos, yan ang binibuild up niya. So when President Marcos visited the United States, he brings along with him all his efforts or concomitant efforts to strengthen our strategic partners with the middle powers. Well, Japan is no longer a middle power, but you know, technically it could be a middle power according to certain indices, but it is not at the level of a hegemon in the sense that militarily wise hegemonic siya. So that's the multi-layer foreign policy strategy of Marcos now, that he sort of brings with him, and because of what the Aquino administration has earlier invested on. Now, is that catching up? Well, I wouldn't say for that part, for foreign policy. So, in other words, what Marcos is catching up is what was lost insofar as
Yeah.
cultivating the relations it had with, or it that we have with the United States. So, yun ang catch-up mode. But yung
Mm.
strategic partnerships, kasi yung foreign policy natin, hindi lang naman yan nakafocus sa US alliance eh.
Yeah.
So, it
Of
is
course.
an interplay of our relationship with the hub and our relationship with the spokes. Tayo ay part of the spokes eh. Yun yung bilateral relations network that we have with the United States. So we sort of, under the Duterte administration, hindi nawala yun. And in fact, part of the reason why uh, under the Duterte administration, if I'm not mistaken, we were able to forge a visiting forces agreement with Australia. But as of now, Marcos is going to work on the possibility of a visiting forces agreement with Japan. So it is at this layer that I think that remains to be rather resilient
Yeah.
relative to the upper layer of that relationship, in which very limited progress was made at the level of our relations with our alliance partner, the United States. So
Yeah.
it's sort of mixed catching up.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking about our the parang kumbaga walang black and white in our relationships. I wonder when it comes to China, because he was asked this actually on his last day in Washington, no, na parang um,
Mm,
he was asked like, how do you even deal with China given its continued aggressions? He's a lot of things also have also been said when he was in Beijing. My promise of a maturing relationship, my promise of a new golden age of relations between Beijing and Manila. How do you actually do that when you have China, you know,
okay.
still being aggressive in the West Philippine Sea? You have
Yeah.
laser pointing incidents. You have a
Yes.
near collision right before the Washington trip. So how
Yes.
how can that even be possible? Kasi feeling ko to the ordinary Filipino, parang paano ka
Oo.
makikipag-usap? Paano ka magiging kaibigan kung
Um,
inaaway ka, kumbaga?
Oo. Alam mo, Bea, pakahalaga ng tanong mo na yan. Kasi totoo, and in fact, parang parang gusto mo talaga sabihin, wow, diplomatic talaga tong taong ito, si Presidente Marcos.
Yeah.
He's an ultimate diplomat. And when I say ultimate diplomat, I mean at the level of speech, at the level of practice, malamang sabihin din siyang isang ultimate diplomat. Ultimate diplomat kasi he knows how to play his cards. He decided to pivot back to the United States when it was time. Clearly, there were clear indications why he should return, uh, pivot back to the United States. Binubuli na tayo very clearly. Pero
Yeah.
uh, ang tanong doon is, earlier I did say that there are certain elements of diplomacy, that is rhetoric or speech and then practice. Yung kay Duterte, si Duterte lang tarang mumurahin ka. So yun ang unang pinipick up ng media at ng entire diplomatic community, if you'd say so. So oras na, pero as I said, hindi clear ang convergence ng speech and action on the ground ni Duterte, because as I've said, the three elements of our relationship with the United States remain to be intact, except that, of course,
Yeah.
somewhere along the lines there were threats to revoke the VFA. There was not much that took place insofar as EDCA, but of course, because of the defense establishment and our foreign policy establishment, sila yung nagka-calibrate ng conduct of the three. Sila yung nag-oversight, like yung review na pinupush for the MDT. So that's the bureaucracy at work. But so ano yung ginagawa ni Marcos? What Marcos is actually doing is employing a strategy by which he sort of hedges against China. So we remain officially as a partner of China in terms of trade. So China
Of
remains
course.
to be our number one trading partner, and you cannot just simply eliminate that unless we strategically diversify our markets and decide as a country that it's about time to diversify and to find other markets, because after all, our experience in the pandemic would reveal that we need to really lessen our dependence on China. But that has to happen. Okay,
Mm.
so in other words, in practice, we remain to be primary. Our primary partner in defense remains to be the United States, and our primary partner in economics remains to be China. Which is why, as a response to that, the United States now is offering the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework
Yeah.
para it's an entire package. We do that, and also the United States, also by initiating this entire economic package during the visit of President Marcos,
Mm.
is also sort of perhaps a response to that, na parang sa amin na lahat, 'di ba? Kasi you cannot cultivate defense solely outside of other dimensions of relations. So no
Yeah.
relations with any country can survive if it's only just limited at, let's say, in the area of defense. So kailangan holistic 'yan. So at the moment, our relationship remains to be bipolar. But
Yeah.
so that's exactly what takes place on the ground. But practice-wise,
Mm.
what do you see it? What is it in Marcos's actions that would reveal that Marcos has shifted from the soft balancing position under the Duterte administration to some form, hindi total, some form of hard balancing. Hard
Yeah.
balancing kasi ay yung ginawa ni Aquino. Yung ginawa ni Aquino is yung subject you China to the arbitral court. Yun ang
Yes.
hard balancing at saka talagang break in relations, confrontation in the Scarborough Shoal, for
Mm.
instance. Pero ang soft balancing naman yung ginawa ni Duterte. Hindi niya inalis yung tatlong
Yeah.
alliance partner pa rin natin ng US. So nandiyan yan. Alliance partner pa rin. Nandiyan pa rin si Balikatan. Medyo
Mm.
downgraded nga lang
Yeah.
talaga. Pero during the time of Duterte, remember, nagkaroon ng Marawi siege. Takbo pa rin siya
Yeah.
sa mga Amerikano. But
Yeah.
because nga there were bureaucratic forces at work, yung kanyang defense establishment ay very actively calibrating the relationship we had with the United States. So, in-acknowledge naman niya ni Duterte yan. And it was also during the time of Duterte that he carried out this counterinsurgency, counterterrorism type of
Mm.
relations with because of the Marawi siege. Okay,
Yeah.
so he admitted that. So there was some kind of there in. So those were the I would say, components of the Duterte practice of Philippine foreign policy vis-a-vis the United States. With Marcos, I would say this medyo hard form of hard balancing is becoming evident in view of the fact that we've revitalized EDCA,
Yeah.
that we've added sites, that the sites are clearly for a specific purpose, that
Yeah.
there is an express articulation of of U.S. ironclad relations with the
Yeah.
Philippines, which would entail collective action, some kind of collective action, ang ibig sabihin ng collective or collective security, some kind of collective security. I would say collective security kasi is an armed attack against one, is an armed attack against the other, and vice versa. So may ganong elemento na ina-articulate na or na-articulate na. So I would say in practice, look at what Marcos is doing, and as a result of that, yung sinabi niya sa China na I will do the same as I engage in the same way as I
Mm.
engage with Americans, ay pareho lamang.
Yeah.
As I would say, it's just a diplomatic statement. Kasi you have
Yeah.
to watch his actions. You have to
Yeah.
watch his actions.
Yeah.
Although, of course, meron siyang caveat na sinasabi na hindi gagamitin yung mga bases sa itaas
Yes.
sa northern part of the Philippines for offensive purposes. You know,
Yeah.
some literature, US-based literature would say that wala yon, walang ibig sabihin yun. Meaning, how could you actually say that? I mean, when the war
Yeah.
erupts between China and Taiwan, for instance, how do
Yeah.
you do that if the bases are actually for the purpose of rotational presence or
Yeah.
prepositioning of American troops, although not
Yeah.
permanent, right?
Yeah.
So, hindi natin masyadong sasabi. But of course, hindi naman ako war expert, but I would say inevitable
Yeah.
yan. So watch
Yeah.
his actions, just listen to his words because
Yeah.
that's the mark of a diplomat.
Yeah, and I noticed too, Washington is very careful. Like on record, off record, officials of the Biden admin are very careful when they're asked about, parang, did you get a commitment from the Philippine president na these bases can be used in event of war in Taiwan or conflict in Taiwan. I noticed they're very careful about answering. They never say yes or no. They obviously don't say
Mhm.
no, but they're very
Okay.
careful about framing it. And I think this might also tie with the Indo-Pacific strategy as well. Like you mentioned kanina, there was a lot of emphasis on trade. Although, syempre, us
Yeah.
journalists and analysts would look at the visit and focus on the defense side of it all. But I feel like the Biden admin put a lot of emphasis on the trade deals that they made with President Marcos during the visit.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you're asking about the trade deals or the trade
No, I'm
aspect?
just relative to the Indo-Pacific strategy of like, I found it very interesting how the U.S. framed it. And it's not
Oh
so
yeah.
much as influencing China, but influencing the world in which China revolves in, or the space in which China moves around in the Indo-Pacific.
Oo. Well, yun ang sabi nila. Oo, tama, tama. Yun ang sabi
Yeah,
nila. Yun ang articulation.
yeah,
So it's not directed against China, but it's a regional order. So, some
yeah,
kind of a
yeah,
meta-regional order. Meta-regional kasi if in the Pacific, so it's they sort of delineated that. So, which is why part of the Indo-Pacific framework is to bring in regional powers that extends from Asia to that part of the region where India is one of your major powers. So, it is some kind of rearranging of this region of the world, which is basically uh, an entire maritime scape. It's an entire maritime scape. So the Indo-Pacific strategy basically is interested basically in the establishment of a liberal rules-based order of observance of rules and norms involving identified regional powers, recognizing the bilateral security arrangement, traditional ones and the evolving ones, in order to preserve maritime security, because maritime security is key to other forms of security. Maritime security consists of would entail a secure trading environment in the maritime sphere. It consists of secure passage of shipping vessels, etc. It ensures freedom of navigation. So yun basically ang Indo-Pacific region. So it is defense slash
yeah,
economic because what do you use the waters for? What is
yeah,
what is the maritime
yeah,
what is the maritime space for? It is not just for
yeah,
defense. It is
yeah,
for safe passage.
yeah,
It's for trade. It's for communication. It's for
yeah,
transport. It's for
yeah,
it's for exploration. It's for
yeah,
research. So yun yung freedom of the seas. Diba?
yeah,
Everyone owns. Nobody owns. Everybody owns. Parang ganon.
yeah,
So but because it is a strategy anchored on which has a defense element, uh, there's a recognition of positioning of states in accordance to their affinities and affiliation. And because this is authored by the United States, it's clearly at the center of the Indo-Pacific region is its bilateral and several and minilateral relations with key powers in the region. Kaya nga may Quad, may
yeah,
AUKUS, at merong yung traditional East Asian post-Cold War, I'm sorry,
yeah,
East Asian or East Asia, Southeast Asia Cold War
yeah,
bilateral security network that the
yeah,
United States has forged with Japan, South Korea,
yeah,
Australia, and Philippines. So
yeah.
yon.
Alma, which leads me to wonder din pala kasi nabanggit din to ni President Marcos when he was asked about balancing US and China. He mentioned also ASEAN. Timing din ngayon magkakasummit in, actually today yung start ng summit in Indonesia. No? What role do you see ASEAN playing? Can it even play a role? Because the bloc has been very infamous for non-action, perhaps. Maybe partially because of its non-interference.
Role of ASEAN in the sorry, Bea, role of ASEAN in
In the geopolitics, especially. So,
ngayon?
yeah,
Okay. ASEAN is very fragmented. Okay? So ASEAN is very fragmented. Kitang-kita natin yan sa kanilang non-stance sa Myanmar. I mean, if you cannot deal with an internal problem, if you cannot deal with an internal regional problem, then how can you deal with an external regional problem? So we know for a fact that number one, the code of conduct has not been
yeah,
finalized by ASEAN. But of course, part of the reason is because of the asymmetrical relations and the power dynamic involving ASEAN as a whole and the fragmented situation that ASEAN is at
Mm.
more so at the moment, and of course
Mm.
China. And its fragmentation, of course, stems from the fact that each ASEAN member state is at different levels of political and economic development, that makes them very much conscious of national interests, and makes that they are unable to subordinate national interests perhaps
Right, right.
to other interests, such as, for instance, interests by which we can look at China
Yeah.
as an actor that that violates the UNCLOS, for instance. And because of differing levels and practices of political and political economic practices, security practices as well, uh, a group of states from within the ASEAN, that Cambodia and Laos and Myanmar are, um, well, we um, well, their relations with China is something that defines the way they
Yeah.
view geopolitical changes involving China as well. So,
Yeah.
which means that their investment in the code of conduct, or their investment in the establishment of a rules based order in the region, is not as much as, for instance,
Yeah.
the investment of, let's say, Philippines and Vietnam
Yeah.
and other claimant states,
Yeah.
including now Indonesia, even if Indonesia is
Yeah.
not necessarily a claimant state, pero ang Indonesia, iba pa rin ang kanyang level of commitment sa code of
Yeah.
conduct,
Yeah.
being the regional leader of the group. Okay. So I'm not quite sure the extent to which ASEAN can play a
Yeah.
role in the very fast changing geopolitical challenges, but of course, it is important that ASEAN centrality, as a result of ASEAN centrality, there are meetings, there are, I would say, clear, extensions of ASEAN centrality, such as, for instance, the EAS, East Asian
Mm.
Summit,
Yeah.
ASEAN regional framework. All of these are led by ASEAN, and it is in these groupings that ASEAN is able to manage its relations with the big powers. And unfortunately, that is only at the level of discussion. So
Yeah.
there is, and part of the reason we draw from that is because ASEAN has different levels of course, of economic development,
Mm.
of, of political positioning as well. So not everyone in ASEAN
Mm.
is equipped to become or
Yeah.
to advance a middle power type of
Yeah.
diplomacy.
Yeah.
So each
Yeah.
each one, and of course there are two tiers in ASEAN. Of course, we have the,
Right.
the other tier, which perhaps is not very much still integrated
Yeah.
in a view that how to very how I mean how what maritime security is in the
Mm.
context of states that observe the rules of international law should actually look like.
Yeah. Ma'am, in relation to what I was asking earlier, if Washington has been very careful about asking questions na yes or no, like will the Philippines let us use their bases? Beijing has also been very careful, at least with respect to the Philippines, no? Na parang they're very careful when they release statements. It's always against the United States. In fact, sabi ni President Marcos, I don't feel alluded to when Beijing hit the meddling in with respect to the bilateral defense discussion, which is quite funny na hindi tayo alluded to bilateral ngayon. But how is Beijing seeing this development? Na kung baga, for the 6 years under Duterte, um, at least on the level of rhetorics, very much Manila was with China. But now we see a return kumbaga daw to normal ties between Washington and
Yeah.
Manila.
Um, your first question is how important are we to the United States right now? And then,
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
my response was we are positioned differently now than perhaps
Yes.
before,
Yes.
like perhaps during the
Yes.
time of Duterte. So my answer is sort of related to that. So what
Yeah.
is our positioning now? It's medyo nag-iba. So
Mm.
we're leveraging our our alliance with the United States now. So you should contextualize China's aggression. China's aggression in the South China Sea began at the time of FVR, Fidel V.
Yeah.
Ramos. By 1997, there was already an incursion of the mischief reef, but that was a time when our military was totally broken. Nothing,
Yeah.
nothing. But you can just trace, for instance, from the time FVR, sino susunod? Macapagal
Yeah.
Arroyo, uh,
Arab, although that was a very short
very
presidency.
brief,
So
okay?
yeah.
Macapagal Arroyo, Aquino,
Yeah.
uh, sige, especially yung kay Duterte analysis.
Yeah.
Okay, from FVR all the way to Aquino, our focus on security is internal security, meaning we were fighting the communists. Okay, but even at the time of President Aquino, if you read the national security policy, the focus remained to be uh, anti-communism, but of course there was an indication. Emmanuel Bautista, who was the main author of the national security policy, sort of nuance the national security policy in such a way that there was an acknowledgement that there remains to be the communist threat, but it was wavering because the armed forces is able to get rid of them quite sooner, but still there. And there was also the challenge of terrorism, but there is a clear desire to shift from internal security to external security. So, but during the time of Aquino administration, nashock pa rin si President Aquino. That's why he delivered the State of the Nation address in which he said, recto is, what did he say about the rectory?
Yung
Something
yung
about
that was a
this,
beautifully written line
yeah,
about
parang
recto reef at recto avenues, comparing the ease of
yeah,
access dapat to the
something like
average
that.
Filipino.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So sinabi niya talaga atin to, 'di ba? Pero that was the context still is internal security, slow shift to territorial defense, because the shift to territorial defense would entail AFP modernization. So during the time of Aquino, he really authored, he supported the modernization of the armed forces. However, we know for a fact that, and my colleague from De La Salle, Renato de Castro, has written extensively about the challenges of having legislators dictate the budgetary requirements of let's say of one organization, specifically defense.
Yeah.
So unfortunately, as a result of the debate between members of the congressional budget, and the defense establishment, we were left with a very limited and very constraining budget to modernize the armed forces. So, in fact, there was a saying that it was during the time of Aquino that our air force was just merely air. There was no force. So, yun yung
Yeah.
konteksto natin, Bea. Yun yung konteksto
Yeah.
natin noon. So,
Pero
yun
it
yung
was a
time.
very sad armed forces at that time.
Yeah. So late 1990s all the way to 2011 to 2016, our armed forces was extremely weak. Even our Coast Guard was very weak. So, pero nung panahon ni Aquino, meron ng mga reviving of the Philippine Coast Guard. There was the National Coast Watch Project, AFP modernization. But again, the context was internal security pa rin ang focus natin. Mag-shift pa lang tayo sa territorial defense. Yun yung panahon na binubuli tayo ng China. So weak armed forces domestically but strong US alliance under all of those administrations, okay.
Yeah.
But now it's different. Now we bring with us a fact that we cultivated our strategic security partnership with the middle powers, galing yan kay Aquino, pinursue ni Duterte, at pinepursue vigorously ni Marcos, at sumasabay rin ito sa Kasi it works both ways. Hindi lang naman tayo nakikipag-partners vigorously sa mga ito eh. Ang Japan is also changing its national security strategy. So it is also increasingly and vigorously wanting to partner with us for a specific purpose. So iba rin ang konteksto nila. So sabay-sabay tayo nagko-converge. Pangalawa, Australia din, di ba? And they are all making different calculations in the context of an imminent war involving China and Taiwan. Okay, they're preparing for that, and they're all increasingly aware of the bullying that's taking place and the revisionism that's taking place in the South China Sea and even in East Asia. Tapos ngayon, we are now operating in the context of the Philippine president who is pro-US.
Yeah.
Yun yun. Tapos, so dahil pro-US ka, you have all the advantages, the material advantages of the alliance. You have
Yeah.
all of that, the trade, so the material and the capability training, exchange of information, technology, imagine all of that. Plus business, okay? So, medyo iba tayo ngayon. So sige, fine. And I'd like to think that China would be China, would behave like China, and in fact, it
Yeah.
already did by releasing those statements. Pero despite that, sige, tingnan natin because the context is much different now. So
Yeah.
we'll see. And again, interestingly, we we are living with a president who will not antagonize China. So I don't know how that what works. So I'm guessing the dynamic is quite different kasi
Yeah.
interesting nga eh, pinatawag niya yung ambassador, meron tayong bilateral protest, pinatawag niya yung ambassador,
Yeah.
hindi naman niya pinatawag niya para mag-explika kung bakit ginawa yung laser pointing, pero
Yeah.
it's being done in the context of diplomacy. It's a continuation of diplomacy short of coercion. Short of coercion pa rin, di ba? So, iba eh. At yung ating DFA secretary
Yeah.
ay mahinahon din. Mahinahon din. So yun ang mga combination of factors. So clearly the Philippine positioning is much different. The power
Yeah.
dynamic in the region seems to converge towards a clear anti-revisionism on the part of China, and there's a strong desire to enforce a rules-based order by any means.
Yeah.
By any means.
It's funny because when you actually put it that way and lay it on the table like this, it's far from simplistic because that's how President Marcos has actually described his foreign policy. Na simplistic, quote unquote, basta ang strategy natin is a strategy of peace. But if you really look, zoom in, and even if you zoom out, it's not simple at all. It doesn't seem to be that way.
Oo. Sabi niya peace, sabi rin niya unity. Siguro ang ibig sabihin lang niya nun ay kasi nga very recently in I think it was in the CSIS forum when he said that he will open a direct hotline with his counterpart and with the defense and with the foreign affairs establishments.
Which China has not complied with. He actually called them out a little bit during en route to Washington. Yeah.
So as I've said, the ultimate diplomat style that he's trying to advance, itong si BBM, it's probably working for him and for us, for our government. Kasi imagine mo kung si Duterte yan. Kung si Duterte yan, the way he attacked the United States, rhetoric kasi, as I said, speech is a very important element of diplomacy. So yun ang unang people get in touch with you with the speech that you make, right? With your utterances. So napaka ng mga salita na ginagamit ni dating Pangulong Duterte na si Bongbong Marcos ay in-eliminate niya yun altogether. He's really very careful and in fact when he was being asked to describe about the human rights violation committed by the Duterte administration, he was even very careful to attack, to say anything negative about the former Duterte administration, notwithstanding the fact that his vice president, of course, is the daughter of the former president. Pero the fact remains is hindi lang siya careful, napaka napaka napaka-diplomatic, I would say, I don't want to use this, but yes, napaka-regal ng pagkaka-frame niya ng ng human rights, ng omissions, ng human rights violations ng former administration. But no attack was made. So which means that he is employing a strategy by which he continues to play the cards of hedging against China. But of course, as I've said, there's power in rhetoric. But again, it is already a shift from the Duterte administration foreign policy. It's already clear because it is no longer soft balancing against China. It is still not bandwagoning to the United States, because bandwagoning is full of affiliation to one major power. Pero we have yet uh, to say that China will no longer be our trading partner. We're no longer going to deal with China. But we have yet to do that. So at this point, what's taking place now is some kind of hard balancing. It is semi-hard balancing of China because of the initiatives that are aimed towards hardening our relationship with Philippine-US in the context of the alliance.
Thank you again, ma'am, for your time. Dr. Alma, for your time. And this is going to be a very interesting development, actually. Kumbaga, in our reports, we called it the completion of the pivot, but frankly, this is just the beginning. I suppose of Malacanang's pivot back to being a closer ally of the White House. So it's going to be interesting how this will actually develop. Wala pang 1 year ang Marcos administration, so we'll see how
That's
far
right.
this alliance goes under Marcos and how China will ultimately, given the
Yes.
promise of a new golden age of Philippine-China ties.
Yes.
We'll see how this goes
Uh,
in the months and years to come.
yes.
Thank you again for your
Ultimate test
time.
talaga 'to. Oo. Okay,
Yeah.
maraming salamat din sa'yo, Ben.
Okay.
Oo,
For your time, and
maraming
thank you
salamat.
for watching this interview. Keep it on Rappler for developments again on not just in Philippine and US ties, but also how President Marcos deals with the geopolitics surrounding Manila and the Philippines. It's been Beko Pin, and thank you for watching.